let me introduce our next speaker, Professor John Wyatt, who's Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at the University College in London. And he's also an honorary consultant neonatologist at the University College London Hospitals. John has been much involved in the biomedical discussions and issues of new technologies. And I'll tell you about a couple of his books at the end. But now he's going to talk about a project he's been involved in at Faraday for the last few years on human identity in an age of nearly human machine. So he's going to tell us today whether a robot could ever have a human identity. Thank you, John.
Right, thanks very much, Liz. Thanks very much. My background is actually as a baby doctor, as a neonatologist working in a very high-tech field of medicine in an intensive care unit in central London. I've retired from the NHS now, but because of my work in neonatology, I was increasingly interested in the questions of how, as technology advances, it changes our understanding of what it means to be human. And that's something that I've been wrestling with for a number of years. And it's really because of that question that I became increasingly interested in the challenges raised by advances in AI and robotics. So how does advancing technology change our understanding of ourselves? And I think that's a very central question which affects us in society as a whole, but it clearly affects those who are religious believers, and I come from a Protestant Christian perspective, and trying to wrestle with this question of what it means to be human in a world of intelligent machines. And that has led to a research project based here at the Faraday Institute. Dr. Beth Singler is at the back, is a research associate on this project, and we've been trying to address this question, coming at it from a number of different angles. We're not going to be able to talk in detail about the project, but I, and I'm sure Beth would be happy to talk about it later on if questions arise. But it's interesting that some people working in the field have explicitly said that they regard their work in robotics as a means of understanding what a human being is like. This is a very unusual guy, Professor Ishiguro from Osaka University in Japan, and the real human is the one up top, and this below is a humanoid robot that he's created, which is designed to be as similar to himself as possible. And apparently he even leaves it in rooms. He goes and the robot attends meetings in his stead, and therefore he can be somewhere else. So there are some robotic manufacturers who are trying to make robots as like human beings as possible. There are many others, and in fact the dominant trend seems to be creating robots that are in many ways much more friendly and childlike. This is something called a Naya robot. It's about 18 inches tall, and it moves, and its eyes light up, and it talks. And it's designed to be cute and cuddly and friendly. I had a very interesting experience last year when I was at a conference with a whole group of senior Christian leaders, including bishops and other eminences. And we were discussing some of these issues, but as part of the conference, we visited one of the computer labs in Durham University. And as we walked into the lab, this group of about 40, mainly men, but some women as well, there were about 5 of these robots on the floor, and they were all switched on, and their eyes were blinking, and their arms were moving, and they were speaking. And instantly, the atmosphere in the room changed, and a bishop, no less, gets down on his hands and knees and says, "Oh, hello, the little darling. Hello, how are you?" And this thing is speaking back. I'm watching this and thinking, good grief. If this is how senior Christian leaders respond, what hope is there for the rest of the population? And it also occurred to me, as I was reflecting on this, that many of the people there would be parents, and they had themselves cared for young children. And one of the things we all discover and know as a parent is that if you come across a little 18-month-old toddling around on the floor, you don't just walk past them and ignore them. The instincts of a parent is immediately to engage and to ask questions, and how are you, and are you safe, and so on. And so I was thinking that in many ways the way these adults were behaving was these unconscious anthropomorphic tendency, the tendency to put humanity onto other objects. This is Sophia, who is produced by a company called Hanson Robotics. And Sophia is described as having uncanny realism. This is off the Hanson Robotics website. She's friendly and empathic. And she's realizing the dream of friendly machines that love and care about humans. So you can see all this very anthropomorphizing language. Some robots are not like this. This is a companion robot called Jibo, and it has a single sort of like an eye which rotates and moves and tracks you. And again, the marketing spiel says he loves to be around people, and the relationships he forms are the single most important thing to him. So you can see this constant theme about trying to, the manufacturers deliberately trying to persuade us to develop relationships with these machines. This is an app which delightfully called the Wobot, which is a mental health app for people with depression. And I'm ready to learn 24/7, no couches, no meds, no childhood stuff, just strategies to improve your mood and the occasional dorky joke. And this is being used seriously by health professionals and others to make what's effectively cognitive behavioral therapy available. But again, it's done in the context of simulating a relationship with a real counselor. So if we just sort of step back and think what's going on, here are human beings on the left, and here are machines on the right. And it seems to me that you can see that there's a two-way process going on. On the one hand, there's a movement from the machine to the human. We increasingly understand ourselves as being machines. We take machine thinking and apply it to our own humanity. And then there's the opposite movement, that we anthropomorphize. We put our human way of thinking onto a machine. We regard a machine as being like a human being. So I think that so often these processes take place at an unconscious level. It's not that we consciously are choosing to do this. This is something which happens at a subconscious level as we are increasingly surrounded by these kind of machines. And it's just interesting to look at the language, with language like somebody being hardwired to like music, to someone programmed to obey parents. You know, if you just think about your language, you can find that these machine analogies occur actually quite common in our speech. Max Tegmark has written a book called Life 3.0. He's a physicist, and so his conclusion is that life is a self-replicating information processing system. So again, these machine analogies. It's interesting that in the history of humankind, we've always tried to understand ourselves by the best technology that was available. And so in an age of ancient science where it was thought that the four elements of which the universe was created was earth, fire, wind, and water, then ancient medicine concluded that, of course, the body was composed of earth, fire, wind, and water, and the reason you had a fever was because you had too much fire, and when you had too much wind, well, you can work that one out. Or alternatively, in the 18th century, when clockwork was very, very common, you can find the philosophers, Diderot, for instance, describes a human being as like a precision clock. And then when hydraulics is very common in the age of hydraulics, lo and behold, the human being can be seen as a connection of tubes and circulating of lymph and so on. And in fact, some people have suggested that the whole Freudian understanding of psychic phenomenon is really hydraulics, this incompressible fluid called libido, which builds up into pressure and comes bursting out. So here we are in the 21st century, and we're in a world which is transformed by information processing machines, and lo and behold, we now understand humanity as a form of information processing machine. And this kind of analogy you hear very frequently. This is Marvin Minsky, well-known roboticist. The brain happens to be a meat machine. And of course, the comparison is that our brains are meat machines, computers made out of meat, but what's the real difference between a computer made out of meat and a computer made out of silicon? They're fundamentally the same. And this kind of machine analogy, I think, is very common in our society. I came across this quote recently, which I rather like. Leon Cass, a well-known commentator in the States, said, "If we regard ourselves as meat, then meat we will become." You know, the more that we take on these kind of analogies, they actually have consequences in the way we think about ourselves. And I think one of the most important things which we need to grapple with is to recognize the critical difference between what is a useful metaphor and what is an ontological description, a description about the ultimate nature of something. So it's perfectly true to say that there are many aspects of the human brain which are machine-like. The machine is a useful metaphor to understand various aspects about brain activity. And so, for instance, you know, there's been an explosion of, for instance, computational neuroscience using techniques of computer to understand mechanisms of within neuroscience, of cognitive psychology, which uses computer-like software as a way of understanding psychological processes. But these are all metaphors. They're not descriptions. And to say that the human brain is a machine is actually philosophically incoherent. It makes no sense at all, as well as being, from a theological point of view, clearly wrong and unhelpful. I mean, an analogy would be say that a fish is basically a submarine made out of flesh. Well, a fish may be like a submarine in certain aspects, in that it goes underwater and it directs and navigates and so on. But to say that the fish is a submarine made out of flesh, you can see, is nonsense. The definition of a machine is that it's something created by a human person in order to achieve a human purpose. So that when you say the brain is a machine, you're clearly saying something that doesn't make any sense. It's similar to say that when you say that a machine understands something, it's a similar kind of metaphor, because machines don't understand anything. It's only persons who can understand things. So, and yet those kind of confusions between what is a metaphor and what is a description is something that I think if you go looking for it, you find happens the whole time in these kind of discussions about the nature of intelligent machines. So there are many aspects of the human brain which are machine-like, but it's both false and incoherent to say that the brain or the human is a machine. And then to come back to think about anthropomorphism again, so a long word, anthropomorphe, derived from human and form. Anthropomorphism is to see a human form in a non-human entity or being. And it's clear that the manufacturers want us to anthropomorphize because this has commercial benefit. The more we can be persuaded to regard these beings as human-like, the more we will become attached to them, the more we will use them, and all the commercial benefits that come from that. And I think in the future we're going to find ourselves increasingly surrounded by different kinds of intelligent machines. Some of them will be completely embodied, so-called incarnate in three-dimensional space. Some of them will be in 2 dimensions, like this avatar. This is Ellie, who's a virtual therapist. And as you can see, there are cameras which are monitoring the human being who is receiving the therapy. And Ellie, the program, is designed to respond in real time to determine the emotional state in real time of the person who is receiving therapy and so on. So there are going to be increasingly these kind of avatars that represent human persons. I think there's going to be an increasing trend of avatars that appear on smartphones and in other forms. You can, the idea that you can preserve all your memories, all your texts, everything you've ever done on a smartphone can all be uploaded, and so that after you die, you can continue to have a social existence. The program will ensure that you continue to text and send emails and engage in social media. And again, there are commercial companies who are trying to do this. This is Replica, an AI friend that's always there for you, and the idea is that you grow your own. So this is fascinating because this is not so much an alternative. This is not somebody who's died, who's another person. This is actually your alter ego. This is you. And some people have suggested that instead of having this sort of conversation we have in our own heads, where we have a dialogue with ourselves in our own heads, the idea is that you will have this dialogue exteriorized with Replica. But you can also, this is, I talk to my dead friend via app. How are you there? I'm okay, a little down. I hope you're not doing anything. So the blue one is the dead person. Oh no, sorry, the blue one is the live person, and the grey one. So Roman says, I'm okay, a little down. I hope you're not doing anything interesting without me. So again, these are all trading on our ability to anthropomorphize, to see a person and behind what is basically a clever machine. So I think some machines, as we've said, will be physical, some will be avatars, some will be entirely disembodied, like this is Google Home or Alexa. It's merely a voice that will talk to us, but that will have no physical presence at all. So anthropomorphism is a universal human tendency which is largely outside our control, our conscious control. It's part of our humanity, and of course it brings profound positive benefits. But at the same time, it renders us open to manipulation and deceit. And of course, this ability to anthropomorphize is also going to be exploited in things like the sex industry. To what extent, how much sex robots are really going to become available, and to what extent they're going to make a difference, again, is a matter of speculation. At the moment, it's still largely science fiction. But it's interesting that people are already starting to talk about it and raise the questions of should there be regulation? How can this kind of technology be used? What is the advent of sex robots going to do to the nature of human relationships? And what kind of regulation should there be? And there's already a campaign against sex robots, which has been started on the view that basically sex robots are primarily instrumentalizing and dehumanizing women in the sex industry, and that's something that we shouldn't allow to be developed further. I think one of the striking and worrying aspects is that there's quite a lot of evidence that if you take a humanoid robot and you do something unpleasant to it in front of an observer, a human observer, then the same responses are aroused in the brain of the observer as would be aroused if you were doing that to a human being. And so if you watch a robot being tortured, quotes, you can have the similar kind of responses as if you were watching a human being being tortured. And I think that raises all kinds of challenging questions we're going to have to face in the future. And is it morally wrong to torture a robot? even if we're not suggesting that the robot itself can feel anything. The question is, what does it do to our humanity if we live in a society where there are people who are torturing robots? I think there's some kind of analogy with, for instance, in our society, we have extremely strong criminal law about what you can do to a kitten. You can be sent to prison for many years for torturing a kitten. Is that really because our society cares so much about the rights of kittens? Or is it because we intuit that if we're a part of a society that does torture kittens, then that's saying something about the nature of our humanity and the nature of our society? And so I think there may be some kind of analogy there with whether we should need to have laws about what you can do with robots. And this is a journalist called David Polgar. Human compassion can be gamed. It's the ultimate psychological hack, a glitch in human response that can be exploited in an attempt to make a sticky product. That's what manufacturers talk about, a sticky product. Their aim is to make the smartphone a sticky product, and they've been amazingly successful. That's why designers give AIs human characteristics in the first place. They want us to like them. And one of the things leading on from that is whether or not there's a morally important difference between developing a quotes relationship with an animal and developing a relationship with a machine. One of these beings is a carbon-based life form, and one of them is a machine. It's actually the one on the left is the carbon-based life form, and the one on the right is a quite sophisticated robot called Paro, which has been designed as a companion, particularly for elder people. And it is designed to respond in real time, to learn the behavioral characteristics of its owner, and it makes noises and mews, and it responds to pleasure and to pain and so on. And there's been a number of studies showing that it has beneficial effects when used in elder homes, in terms of reducing anxiety and improving mood and so on. And so one of the questions is there a difference? Does it matter? If we, by and large, we tend to think that if an older person has a pet, or if we have a pet that we anthropomorphize and then enjoy caring for and looking after, by and large, this is seen as a positive thing. So is it different if it's a machine? Or that's perhaps something that would be interesting to discuss further. And the question of robot rights, is there some point at which robots should be considered as moral agents, and therefore they are worthy of respect? And there are already some philosophers. This is a young philosopher, David Gunkel, who's written a book called The Machine Question. And he argues that the moral community starts off very small, with a small group of white males, and then gradually the moral community widens to include males and females and people who are white and not white, and ultimately to every human being on the planet. And then the moral community starts to enlarge further as people start to think about the rights of primates and other animal species. And the next logical step is that the moral community is going to enlarge again as we start to consider the rights of machines and the need to protect machines from potential harm. And I think it's only a matter of time before there are machines that claim to be sentient, that claim to have awareness. And I think this is going to lead to all kinds of philosophical, practical, social, and theological issues. And one of the fundamental issues that it raises is, of course, the problem of other minds. Because how do you know that I'm conscious? How do I know that you're conscious? It's something that we intuit that because we share so much in common, that we assume, therefore, that what's going on in one another's heads and others' first-person experience is similar to my own. But how can we ever know what is going on within the circuitry of a machine? How can we ever have any awareness? And if this machine claims, if it has the behavior of a conscious being, if it claims to be conscious, then how are we as a society going to deal with that? Some people have suggested there should be panels of sort of neuroscientists and computer psychologists, quote, who will assess new programs and try and work out, according to set criteria, whether they meet a standard to be accorded rights. Now, again, this maybe all sounds fiction, it may be some way off, but I have a suspicion it's not that far off, as the ability to simulate. We've already seen the progress that's being made, for instance, in Google in producing conversational agents which can behave almost, can simulate human behavioral responses. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to imagine that agents could advance to the stage at which they can give the same kind of behavior as a conscious being. So I just now want to look at a specifically Christian perspective on this as we come to the end. The Cappadocian Church Fathers were very significant in the development of early history of Christian doctrine, and they developed this concept of the Holy Trinity as being composed of hypostases, persons. They took a Greek word and applied that to mean something new in Christian theology, the concept of a person. But they said they were hypostases in ekstasis. In other words, they were persons who were giving themselves. They were giving themselves to others. And so in Trinitarian thinking, reality consists of more than just matter and energy. But I think that rather than think of substance dualism, the traditional sort of substance dualism which goes back to Descartes, it's actually more helpful to think of the immaterial category of the personal, so that there is matter and energy, but there is another kind of being, another kind of reality that is the personal. And in Trinitarian thinking, personhood is a category of reality which is, to use the jargon, ontologically foundational. In other words, you cannot define a person in anything which is more basic. Once you've talked about a person, you've reached the foundational level of description. Ultimately, in Christian thinking, to be a person is to be like the persons of the Trinity. It is they who define what it means to be a person. And persons are not reducible to matter and energy, and they are not limited to matter and energy. And persons are constituted by their relations. So what the Cappadocian Fathers developed was a theology by which the personhood of the Father was constituted by the existence of the Son. It was not possible to be Father unless the Son existed. And similarly, it was not possible to be the Son unless the Father existed. So the very being of the Father depends on the Son, and the very being of the Son depends on the Father. They are constituted, the persons are constituted by their relations and by the freedom they have, the movement of communion, the freedom they have to give themselves to one another in love. And so, in this way of thinking, to be a person is to participate in some sense in the divine life of the triune God. We are persons whose being is derived ultimately from the persons of the Trinity. And I think that way of thinking I've found to be very fruitful when it comes to thinking about, for instance, medical ethical issues, about the responsibilities we owe to other persons and so on. And so in place of the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, what Trinitarian thinking would say, you love me, amor, ergo sum. I am loved, therefore I am. In other words, my very being is constituted in my relations. And I think that way of thinking has some very profound consequences as we think about what it means to be a human person. Another person who came at this from a slightly different angle was Buber, a Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. He came from a Jewish background, and he wrote a famous book, Ich und Du, I and Thou, and he said there were two fundamental relations, the I-it relationship and the I-you relationship. And he develops, I recommend you to read it if you've never read Buber. It's a very fascinating, unusual read. And he develops the distinctions between these relationships. And in fact, he says that the I-you relationship is primary. The first relationship we're ever conscious of as a child is actually the I-you relationship. It's only gradually as we develop as a child we learn to differentiate between what's an I-you and what's an I-it. And ultimately, he says the I-you relationships we have between humans, of course, also reflect the possibility of an I-you relationship with the author of life himself. So I think differentiating between the I-you and the I-it relationship is probably going to be very important as we think about intelligent machines. I want to argue that the relationship we have with a machine, so-called, is always going to be an I-it relationship. But the challenge is, as the technology becomes ever more sophisticated, it will seem increasingly like an I-you relationship. So it will attempt to simulate the characteristics of an I-you relationship. I think something else I've become aware of is, and that is for many technologists, they have a very instrumental understanding of relationships. So if you ask many technologists, what are relationships for? And of course it's not just technologists, many people would get this reaction in our society. What are relationships for? They would say, well, relationships are to basically give you nice feelings. And when you have a relationship, it evokes all these nice feelings of warmth and a feeling of security and of intimacy and all these positive things inside me. And that's what relationships are for. And if a relationship doesn't evoke those nice emotions, well, then there's something wrong with the relationship. But then you go on and say, well, of course, if my relationship with my machine evokes the same kind of emotions, evokes the same kind of feelings inside me, well, what's the problem? That's what relationships are for. And that's that kind of instrumental view of relationships. Whereas I think if you would take Buber, and Buber was one of the influences on Karl Barth, who developed his own version of this kind of relationship, what some people call dialogical personalism, the idea that persons are in dialogue. They would see something much more profound and ineffable in the I-you relationship. It's not just about evoking feelings. It's about something far more significant. And I think most of us have this experience, don't we, that there are moments, and of course not all relationships at all times are like that, but there are moments in relationships where we do reach something very profound, something very transcendental, when we make contact at a very profound level with another person, a person who is different from us, but is made out of the same kind of being. But just another aspect of ancient Christian theology which I think is also relevant, and that is that when the Church Fathers were developing their understanding of the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, they were wrestling with the questions, was the Son part of the creation? Was as the same as everything else? And their answer was no. The Son was born, not made, or in the Old English, begotten, not made. And that distinction is a very profound distinction. That which we give birth to is fundamentally the same as us. Those of us who have children know that our children come as a gift from our being, and they're equal in status and dignity to ourselves. We care for, nurture, and educate our children, but we cannot control them or determine their nature. What they are is given to them, and we have no way of determining what our children are. But that which we make or create is fundamentally different from us. It's a product of our will, and it's therefore ours to mold and control. And so we can determine what it is for and what it will do. And so again, I think that distinction, if we apply that distinction to the robot, the intelligent machine, we would say that this is a being which is made, it's not born. And that means that we do have the right to control it. We do have the right to determine its use. But that it's fundamentally different from human beings who are born and not made. So in summary, intelligent machines, I think, will increasingly play a role as simulated or analogous persons. They will play the role of being a person in interactions with humans, and that may lead to all kinds of positive benefits. But they cannot share our human nature, and they cannot participate in genuine I-you relations. And I think this distinction may be increasingly important as we're surrounded by machines that simulate human behavior, relationality, and personhood. And just for debate, to what extent should we welcome the introduction of simulated companions for elderly people, for people with dementia, for children, for those with psychiatric disorders and so on? It's interesting that the main target audiences for these companions are the vulnerable. They're human beings who in different ways are especially vulnerable. And yet they're seen as a likely target for machines. And how should this technology be regulated in order that it's employed to protect and enhance human flourishing rather than threaten it? So one example, for instance, should there be a law that says whenever something is trying to simulate or appears to simulate a human person, that it should by law be required to regularly state, I have to tell you I am not a person. I have to tell you I'm not a human being. As a way of preventing this kind of deception or manipulation which can occur. And should the deliberate maltreatment, sexual abuse, and torture of human-like robots be made illegal? So just a few questions to think about. And that's the name of the project which is currently underway. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, John. Plenty to think about there. Before we go to questions, I just want to highlight John's books. One on bioethics in general, Matters of Life and Death, which is on the bookstall, and also a relatively new book out this year, Dying Well, about assisted dying. So, but now, any questions about the talk you've just heard? Yes, Andrew.
Thank you, John. Just to be provocative, and I'm not saying I believe this position, but what would you say if someone said that, well, the ultimate in fulfilling our being in image of God would be to create in the same way God has created us? We're not born of God in the same way as Jesus is born of God. And therefore, if we altruistically make robots, not for utilitarian purposes, but to genuinely love them, then they're deserving of all the compassion we can give them. What would you say to that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think obviously the motivation is important. What are we making these machines for? And your answer was we're making them so we can love them. I would say that's a category mistake. You can't love a machine because love by definition is something that happens between persons. You can simulate love, but it isn't the real deal. And I would also go on to say there seem to be so many people in the world already who are unloved that might it not be better to spend our efforts on loving those who need love rather than creating machines and putting simulated love on them. But perhaps that's a bit harsh.
So you're saying it's impossible, in effect, to make other creatures in the same way God has made us?
To make persons. That's why I think this language about personhood is a helpful way in. It's clearly possible to make creatures, but that's what the machines are. If they are created beings, it's possible to make synthetic life. It's possible, at least in theory, to create organisms, but that's not the same as making a person. So I would believe, following that train of thought, that whatever we create does not have personhood. It may simulate it.
But that's because you believe a person is born of another person.
Correct.
And would you therefore say we, as human beings, we're born of God, not made by God?
No, I think the distinction is we are made. So whereas the Son is born, I mean, it's some heavy theology here, but if you take Orthodox Christian theology, the distinction is that the Son is born from the nature. That's what the Nicene Creed said. Whereas we are part of the creation. We are made from the will of God. But God himself, as a person, has the ability, it seems, from Christian theology, to give us his personhood.
Okay.
And that's something, I don't think he's given us that gift to donate personhood to the products of our hands.
Okay, any more? Now, let's, can we go just in the same row?
We're creating robots which are very humanoid, and I think it's a Turing test that says at that point where we can't distinguish between a human and a machine, we've succeeded. We really can't make any other kind of robot because we've no idea how dolphin intelligence, for example, works. So we couldn't make it in any other way than ourselves.
Well, we've no idea how our intelligence works. So I think that whatever intelligence the machine has, it's not human intelligence. It is machine intelligence, such as it is. It is some kind of machine processing. But I think it is only simulating human reasoning. I mean, the way that the machine beats the chess master at Go, there's no relationship to the way human beings play chess. It's an entirely alien kind of process that's true for all games, but it's also true, for instance, in any other things that computers do in terms of big data. The way that Alexa decides what words it's going to produce has absolutely no relationship to the way we decide what words we're going to produce. It's a product of a completely different kind of process. So I think that machine intelligence, to be honest, this is why the concept of what used to be called strong AI, as opposed to weak AI, and it's now generally called artificial general intelligence, which is the idea of making a machine that will behave in all respects like a human being. Frankly, that is philosophically incoherent. It's not going to happen. It cannot possibly happen. Well, the only possible way it could happen, and this is science fiction, is that you create a machine which mimics every single neuron and every single, 10 to the 14 connections, plus everything that comes from our birth and from our inheritance and everything else. That's a sort of thought experiment, which frankly is so far from reality that it's probably not worth carrying on down that line. But so I think we should push back there's a lot of hype arguing that the machines are behaving, quotes, like humans. They're not at all. They are nothing like humans. But for various reasons, the developers want to make them seem, appear, simulate human reasoning. But I was at a conference recently where a quite senior computer scientist said, it's a bit like the difference between having a real plant in your house and having a plastic plant. The plastic plant could look in every way like the real plant, but we know it's plastic. It's just not the same thing.
No, yes, just in the row in front.
Thank you for your talk. I'm thinking about years ago now when my dad used to watch a film called Frankenstein, and it was based on a similar idea of this sort of robotic sort of person, but I think within the film they inserted a human brain within the robot. And I'm just wondering if you think that, you know, in modern science, whether that's something that they could consider doing then, and then sort of articulating then, oh, it has got thoughts and feelings then, having a brain put into it.
Yes, so the question really is about whether it's possible to put a human brain or in some way into a machine. Well, again, I think, to be honest, this is, at the moment, a long way away in terms of science fiction. I mean, what is happening at a sort of very basic level is that they are creating computer chips that have brain cells in them, which are a sort of combination of living brain cells connected to transistors and a cellular. So at a cellular level, that is already happening. I mean, whether it's going to be successful, whether it's going to lead to anything, is unlikely. But the relationship with science fiction and technology is very interesting and important. And part of the project we've been doing here at Faraday has been trying to look at some of the science fiction stories which are very influential in the way that technology develops. And one of the things I've realized is there's an interesting sort of symbiotic relationship between the science fiction and the technologists. Many of the technologists who are working in this field grew up with science fiction, like Frankenstein and like Star Trek and I, Robot and all the novels of Asimov and so on. And a lot of what they're trying to do, either consciously or unconsciously, is make the science fiction come true. So there is that kind of relationship between sometimes trying to work out what's fiction and what's fact is complicated. But I think that we should, again, try to distinguish and push back against the hype, which tries to make that more draw us in, make us feel that technology is more powerful than it really is.
Okay, any more? We'll just... Can you just wait for the microphone, please?
Oh, well, I did want to come back and say that in context of the science fiction, so when I was younger and there was no such thing as mobile phones, and I remember a film coming on where they had the first walkie-talkie.
Yes.
But now that's a reality.
Yes.
So, you know, in years.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's interesting that so many science fiction films about robots end badly. I mean, so often it's this dystopic thing about it all going horribly wrong and the robots taking over. And one of the interesting things is why there are so many negative science fiction tropes about robots. You know, the Terminator. I know something that Beth often complains about, the fact that whenever you have a story about robots in the newspapers or media or whatever, there's an image of the Terminator, as though this is always the way that robots, the discussion about robots takes place.
Great. Now we're working our way around the room, so we will get to you. And I think there's a question here.
Isn't the whole difference between a machine and human is on those qualities like consciousness and self-awareness and volition? And the idea that people would even start to ask the question, will machines ever achieve consciousness, would come from the thought that human beings are the culmination of a very, very long but unbroken chain moving from inanimate matter in the Big Bang to where we are today. So therefore we kind of they might say that that is one example where inanimate matter turned into what we are today, and that's consciousness. So therefore it could potentially happen again. It would be very different. It would be machine qualities or phenomena. But, you know, that isn't that where that kind of question comes from, which is, you know, I'm pretty sure never ever going to happen. But isn't, you know, that's why the question gets asked?
Thanks. Yes, well, I think it often is framed in those terms. You're right. It's often framed as though the real issue is consciousness. And it is argued, as you say, that clearly what's happened in the evolution of humankind is that you start with inanimate matter and you end up with a conscious human being. Well, conscious machine. But, well, that's the metaphor, you see, and I think you can't say we're conscious machines. We're not. So we need to be, conscious phenomena would be better. Well, that's the argument, and certainly if you take a completely physicalist philosophy, in other words, as you probably worked out, I'm not a physicalist. A physicalist says there is nothing but matter and energy, and anything that is immaterial is simply emergent upon the matter and energy. Now, if you take that position, then you do have to say that it is logically entirely possible that the same process that has happened in human evolution can happen in a machine. If the brain is simply wiring, it's simply mechanisms, then, and yet consciousness emerges, then there's absolutely no reason to say that consciousness may not emerge again. Incidentally, that's also the root, I think, of a lot of the dystopia about intelligent machines, because if you say that, if you take that physicist perspective, you have to say every possible thing that's ever come out of the human brain, and that means not only all the most beautiful things that have happened, like cathedrals and Mozart, but also all the most terrible, evil things that human beings have ever done. All that is a product of wiring. It's simply a product of mechanical processes. And if, therefore, it can happen once, it can happen again. And therefore, it is theoretically possible that something profoundly evil and destructive might emerge out of the computer wiring. That's where physicalism leads you, if you take that. But I personally feel that to focus on consciousness actually leads you down a philosophical rabbit hole because of the problem of defining or proving the problem of other minds. So it's never going to be possible to know whether this machine is conscious or not. And there are, as I said, there are going to be machines that claim to be conscious, that simulate behavior which we interpret as conscious. And there seems to me a sort of philosophical circularity there that we can't get out of. If you make consciousness the defining feature as to what gives significance, then I don't see how you're ever going to distinguish between the genuine article, as we understand it, and the simulation. And that's why I want to put the defining features rather differently, and I want to put it in terms of our fundamental human nature, and I want to put it in terms of this concept of personhood. But that's a particular perspective which I'm putting forward.
So, any more? Yes. Here.
Thank you. I had two questions, if I may. First, I didn't quite understand the ethical issue that you alluded to, but didn't state clearly regarding sex robots. Just to simplify and be brief, aren't they just another level of sex toys? So why are people making campaigns, as you said, and claiming that that is demeaning toward women? or toward men, could be the other way around. Second question is, if we define personhood as you did toward the end, as in, you love me, therefore I am, then can't that also include animals? I'm sure there are dogs that genuinely love and are loved, and I'm sure there are, we have seen in documentaries dolphins that recognize and show joy and happiness after meeting their trainers after many years. So there's a profound relationship as you described it. So I think these kinds of deep relationship and love, etc., in my view, will lead us to enlarge the definition of personhood and not keep it to humans. So I'm not sure that that track is going to stop the robots from being persons.
Thank you. Yeah, the argument about sex robots is quite complex and is really to do with the implications for relationships between the genders and the instrumentalization of women. So the argument goes that there's a difference between a sex toy, which just lies there, to put it crudely, versus a being which is designed to reproduce as much as possible the reaction of a human being. And just to make it more obvious and more painful, there are, if people are talking about, you can make machines that will simulate what it's like being raped, and the experience of a child robot, and a child robot which will behave in a realistic way when it's being abused. And so, then we start to say, well, is this appropriate for the way that as human beings we behave? And there will be those who argue, well, it's harm reduction and it's better that they abuse a toy than they abuse a real child and so on. But I think it does raise the more fundamental questions about what kind of society do we wish to belong to? And therefore, should there be laws about what you're allowed to do with something that is simulating a human person with ever increasing degrees of accuracy? Going back to the love, can we love a dog? I would regard, I have no doubt that people have very profound responses to a dog, and I've seen that myself, observing other people. But I have to say, I think it's anthropomorphism. I mean, the dog has what dog psychologists say is that the dogs really don't understand love as we understand love. Love is something between persons. And so I would want to maintain that distinction. Having said that, I think there is a profound, if I can answer my own question, is there a difference between a relationship with a dog and a relationship with Paro the seal? I would want to answer yes, there is. And that's because the experience of the dog, although it's not a person, is in many ways similar to a human person. In other words, the dog was born out of the body of another dog. The dog was a baby dog. The dog learnt about the world, learnt about reality, had painful experiences, had nice experiences, bonded with different beings and so on, has a history, and all of that contributes to when the dog wags its tail, it's behaving in a doggy manner. It is being consistent with its dog-like nature. You compare that with the robot. The robot has none of that. The robot is purely artifact. It is mechanisms, clever programming. It has no history. It has no experience. It is simply simulating the behavior of a carbon-based life form. And so I think the dog is being authentic to its own nature, whereas there is something profoundly inauthentic about Paro. Paro is just a simulation, but is not genuinely being consistent with its own nature. And so I feel there is a difference, and that would draw me to feel very uneasy about giving Paro to somebody with dementia, for instance, or to a child without explaining that this isn't a real dog, this isn't a real animal.
Okay, I'm aware of 4 people who want to ask more questions. If anyone else has one, you'll have to write it down and put it in the box. But we'll just go here and then 3 more at the back. So.
I think you may already have answered my question, because I was thinking of the film Ex Machina, which starts with trying to meet the Turing test, and actually the robot gains freedom when it's learned true humanity, how to lie, betray, and murder.
Yes, thank you. And it's interesting that Ex Machina, for those of you who haven't seen the film, it has this twist at the end where you think that this robot is a victim, and then right at the end, the twist comes and you realize actually the robot is manipulating, the robot is in control and is having its own agenda. And I think that the Turing test in many ways is outdated. It was a very influential concept when it first came along. The essence of the Turing test is it's about deception. Can you deceive somebody that, and it was done with a teletype, that this was a machine at the end of the teletype rather than a human being. Whereas really what's happening now is not about deception. It's about a sort of willing suspension of disbelief. So when we engage with Alexa or with these little Paro robots, there's part of our brains which knows that this is not real, but we have a suspension of disbelief. We want to behave as though it was real. We want to enter into the game. And so that there seems to be a strong drive to develop these kind of intimate relationships with technology.
I have a bonus question from Professor Van Woudenberg here.
Many thanks for your fascinating talk about love. Wouldn't it help your case to say there are different types of love? Because you may say, well, there's love for one's country.
Yeah.
That's not a reciprocal form of love. There is love for the piano, or love of literature, or love of dogs, or pets, or whatever. But there is this peculiar sort of reciprocal love, and that's what you need for your arguments, I do think.
Okay,
so
thank you.
That
yes.
was a friendly suggestion.
Thanks very much. No, I think you're absolutely right. That is a helpful way of thinking about it. And it's interesting that in the development of Christian theology, the Christians developed this particular Greek word, agape, which reflect that sort of highest kind of love, which was a self-giving love. And I would say, yes, you can't have agape with a dog. The essence of agape is this mutuality. But yes, you can have other kinds of affection. You can have other kinds of experience. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, now the gentleman with the stripy shirt here.
Thank you. As a clumsy person, I was just thinking about unintended consequences. So, for example, a machine that might take, say, books from one side of a room to another and be programmed just to do a repetitive task. It might be programmable and programmed to be able to do that, but then on the way it might knock over something that was in the way.
Yes.
Okay. Now that will be an unintended consequence of the task. So obviously there's a danger there. I'm just wondering, is there anything you might want to say as well in terms of the research project, which is all about the impact of advances and the effects on human identity, in terms of unintended consequences of going down this path?
Thanks very much. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of the, I think unintended consequences is one of the sort of take-home messages of the last 30 years of the advancement of technology. It's interesting, just if you take, it's 10 years ago since Steve Jobs first announced the first iPhone, the idea of a smartphone. And not even Steve Jobs had any concept of what a smartphone was going to do to human society. And the way that this has become so much part of our lives. And particularly if you try and remove a smartphone from a teenager's hands, you will discover that as far as teenagers go, it is not possible to live without a smartphone. So something that was intended, in very different ways, can have extraordinary unintended consequences. So I think the same is very likely to be true of many of these aspects of technology, that we just don't know what. For instance, there's already been concerns about the effects on young children of having Alexa in homes, because Alexa responds to very clear commands: switch lights on, play music. And so young children are learning that that's the way to speak to human beings. And, was that intended as part of having an Alexa in the home? But so, I think there are many, many ways in which unintended consequences are going to happen. So I think one of the questions we need to ask, as being concerned about regulation, is when something is introduced, what is being lost? What is being lost when you get your music through Alexa rather than in the ways we used to do it? And are we happy about what we are losing? And often it's not always apparent straight away what we are losing. It only becomes apparent with time what we're losing. But I think it's going to be a very important question for us to ask as technology is introduced, and particularly because so much of it is driven by commercial factors.
All right, now, Ty, who's been waiting patiently. There's a human relationship.
Yes, yes. Just a quick comment on the smartphone before I get to my question. I was speaking in Asia and said to a fairly large group, if you'll pull out your Bibles, and 90% of them pulled out a smartphone. Yeah. Anyway, I'm reflecting on what you're talking about and realize that this impulse to try to simulate intelligence and someone like ourselves is a technological reflection, but it's an impulse in humanity all the way back. You look in the history of religions and the gods of the ancient Near East, and you see all the same aspects of how they imagined the gods to be like themselves, and that was an increasingly anthropomorphized view, from sun and moon to actual people-shaped things who act like people, who do what people do. The idea that the humans would take care of them and that the gods would then take care of the human beings. So there's a utility factor. There's even a weaponization factor. The gods will fight on their behalf. And the simulated companions of the relationships that they felt with their gods in the ancient Near East, attributing personhood and identity to the gods. And all of that reflects, it seems, a human impulse to do that. All of that in ancient times was a non-technological artificial intelligence in a way of speaking.
Yes.
Can you reflect on that, about kind of this same kind of impulse and the different ways that we approach it?
Yes, thanks very much. It's a trite saying, but I think it has some truth, isn't it? It's often said that God made human beings in his own image. It wasn't long before they returned the compliment. And we've always been making gods in our own image. And it clearly is something that is very deeply rooted in our humanity. It's interesting, isn't it? In the biblical narrative, this is by and large seen as a very negative thing. And as I've sort of reflected on this, I've thought in the Christian tradition, there are really two different ways of thinking about a created image. On the positive side, there is the whole tradition of the icon, where the icon is seen as a window into a spiritual reality. By creating an image of a human being, we are getting insight into a deeper spiritual reality. And it's seen as a very positive thing. But on the other hand, there is the idol, and the idol is something seen as a substitute, and as something that we are giving to this inanimate being some kind of malign spiritual significance. And one of the striking things is that in the Old Testament narratives, the difference between the idols and the living God was that the idols couldn't speak, the idols couldn't move, and the idols were ultimately powerless. And now what we're doing is we're creating idols that can speak, idols that can move, and idols that have autonomous agency. And so, just seen at that spiritual level, you could say, well, there is the potential there for, because the human heart, was it Calvin who said the human heart is an idol factory, you know, that we have the potential of creating new and powerful idols. And but maybe some of these could be icons. Maybe they could be ways of helping us to understand spiritual reality in a more profound way.
As someone that works in education, I've noticed, you mentioned about smartphones and taking them away from teenagers, and we do that at the school that I'm a part of, and it is terrifying to them. But I've noticed that what's happened with students is they are persons, yet through those devices they've learned to relate to each other as they make their own icon, basically, or they make a commercial of themselves and show that as personhood.
Yes.
And that if we're not careful, they actually prefer that.
Yeah.
So in thinking about the future of this kind of technology, could you envision a time in which so that the damage done to our humanity would be one that would be our preferring the relationship with robots to the relationship with human beings, because we don't have to treat the robots. It frees us from any moral obligation. And they won't be programmed to be human. They'll be programmed to be subservient to make us happy.
Yes, thanks very much. Well, I think that is right. And in fact, there are already some, I've heard some men say effectively that. They say, you know, I'm just terrible at relationships. Wherever I go, I just cause wreckage and broken hearts, and it's all a disaster. I'd be much safer with a machine. If I want her on talkative mode, I can have her on talkative mode, and if I don't want to talk, I can have her on silent, and you know, and she's always there for me, and she doesn't argue back, and she doesn't complain about me, and what's not to like?
Yeah, but my wife is not like that.
Really?
Yeah.
That's strange.
So, what that means is she stretches me into the kind of into something that looks more like full humanity.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas if we would make an army of robots to serve all of our needs, the one thing that we could be pretty certain of is they would never do that stretching, because often that stretching doesn't make us very happy.
And this again is part of that this profound person-to-person relationship, isn't it? It's part of communion. That communion between fallen beings is not necessarily a pleasant activity. I mean, it often causes pain and failure of communication, but as you say, it's stretching. It's part of the way we grow. It's part of the way we are ultimately transformed into the likeness that we're supposed to bear.
So on that note, I think we'll draw stumps. If there are any remaining questions, do submit them in the box, and they will. Our chair will have to be challenged by deciding which questions to ask. But let's thank John for his hard work.